This article was originally published on my blog, and you can find links to it below. Phantom Status Quo 1. For a moment, let's place ourselves in a fictional world where we are capable of rational thought, where all things we know in the past are also known in the present, where we can use this information to make reasonable, even if probabilistic, assumptions about the effects of our actions. In this world, I can see a single reason for not changing the status quo. Effort. It requires an amount of effort disproportional to the predicted benefits. 2. Downgrading to a world with rational actors, which are near perfect predictors, given all current data, but where we aren't omniscient about the past. There is a second reason: lack of information that might have been available to those that erected the status quo. 3. Going further down, in a world where we are rational, but are neither near perfect predictors nor omniscient about the past, we get unforeseen consequences. A change might look promising, but if the change is a big enough departure from the status quo, we risk slipping into issues that we couldn't have foreseen. Combine these two things and we get Chesterton's fence. Quote, "There exists in such a case a certain institution or law, let us say, for the sake of simplicity, a fence or a gate across a road. The more modern type of reformant goes gaily up to it and says, 'I don't see the use of this, let us clear it away.' To which the more intelligent type of reformer will do well to answer, 'If you don't see the use of it, I certainly won't let you clear it away. Go away and think. Then, when you come back and tell me that you do see the use of it, I may allow you to destroy it.' In other words, even if we see no reason for the status quo to exist, that might just be due to our lack of foresight or hindsight. The status quo might seem obvious if we were better at predicting and/or had the data available to those that built it. 4. Coming back into the real world with imperfect data, imperfect predictive abilities, and irrational humans, we get the final two arguments for the status quo. Loss aversion, the perceived disutility of giving up an object, is greater than the utility associated with acquiring it, and omission bias, if the status quo is bad in some way, but changing it would cause harm in some other, more minor way, we will be biased as to amplify the harm caused and minimize the harm avoided. But let's assume we struggle to act rationally and think that various mental biases are artifacts, potentially useful artifacts, e.g. a built-in awareness of Chesterton's fence, but artifacts that can be discarded in a situation where we can see the higher level objections against this change don't apply. I think codebases might make for a perfect thought experiment here. Let's assume that in our codebase everything is camel case. A new guy comes along citing a study that claims a 6% decrease in release bug if a team uses nay case for variable names. We can't bring the argument from effort here, since refactoring camel case to snake case takes about 4 button clicks on our IDE, a push to master, and telling everyone to pull it. It might cause minor inconveniences, e.g. people having to do slight refactors to the PRs they are working on, but even if there is a 10% chance that the study is correct, 0.6 less release bugs on average are a worthwhile goal. Chesterton's fence doesn't apply either, since code is fairly deterministic. Our tools will warn us of any potential resulting naming conflicts, and in the slight off chance that anything might still go wrong, we have our unit tests. Do we, as wannabe rational actors, change our code to snake case? I don't know. I think this is an example of what I'd call a phantom status quo. It's a status quo which can be easily changed with easy to foresee consequences. Most status quo are solid and entrenched. We might all agree that a certain change to the building code of our city would be nice, but we'd have to go ahead and physically modify every house. Furthermore, we aren't perfect predictors. We couldn't really know this change is desirable until we tried it, at which point we would have sunk a lot of effort into it. In a code base, however, the status quo is often easy to change and the changes are easy to test. So the main obstacles behind changing things are gone. I don't want to be irrational, but I also know that if a new team member came to me and told me, hey, we should change the casing of our variables to this because a study shows that it reduces release bugs by 6%, my default reaction would be no. Even if I had read the study, and the study had good methodology, had good theoretical arguments, and was done by people I trust, my reaction would still be no. Or, perhaps more realistically, let's say our deployment toolchain uses a specific compiler, say Clang. Someone comes in saying that GCC just made some improvements in areas XYZ, so switching to GCC should bring a 2% overall speed improvement. I think my reaction here is still no. But is there any rational reason to defend a phantom status quo? The ones I can come up with are as follows. 1. Avoiding minor improvement loops. Let's stick to the compiler example. Say that we only spend 30 minutes, on average, to change the compiler that we use to release. Let's also say that I believe it's reasonable to spend 30 minutes in order to improve performance by 2%. But what if, in 2 weeks, Clang releases a new version with improvements XYZ? Now, one of our Clang using developer notices that Clang suddenly produces 4% faster binaries than the GCC version. Well, had I made the first change, now I'd be forced to once again change compilers. What if this happens every few weeks? Either Clang or GCC ends up compiling our code slightly better. And now I have to spend 30 minutes every 2 weeks changing release compilers. Furthermore, the change will not be instant. Maybe everyone is busy right now. Maybe it takes 1 week to make the change. This means that I am missing out on that 4% performance for a whole week. I basically got 3 weeks of a 2% improvement out of switching to GCC, but I would have gotten 2 weeks of 0% improvement and 1 week of 6% improvement if I had just stuck to Clang, and I'd have saved 60 minutes of my life in the process. Granted, this is a contrived example, but I think it generalizes. Usually, when I make a change for the sake of performance, I look for 2x kind of improvements, and I'd wager this is the underlying reason. The time it takes to write inline before every function that only gets called once might be the time it takes for your compiler to get smart enough to do that inlining on its own. 2. Avoiding bike shedding loops. Assuming we are perfectly rational actors that never care about leaving a mark or signaling importance, bike shedding is not an issue. However, I feel like even in a semi-fictional world, I can't make this assumption with a clean heart. At some point, if an impactless change is allowed, people will start making impactless changes all the time. A good example of this is the NPM effect, where people constantly broke down things into smaller and smaller packages, until you got to monstrosities such as is odd and is even. The fact that something like is odd came about is not even the scary part. The scary part is that it has 32 dependencies. But this sort of reasoning stems from realizing that the status quo is spectral. There is no obvious harm in breaking up submodules out of a package into their own packages, or writing an abstraction to tidy up some code. However, there is also no obvious stopping point. It might be that John Sinclair and his 1,500 micropackages are just some sort of postmodern artistic statement. But even so, art is a mirror to reality, and I think this perfectly well illustrates that point. Granted, the problem here is that you can't follow the opposite of this advice either. If you never modularize anything, you'll end up with an ugly monolith. I think the "is there a huge benefit" rule applies here fairly well. If you come up with a really good argument as to why splitting stuff will save you time, split it up. If you can't, then don't do it, even if you could do it and there is no obvious argument against it, because there are no good arguments against it all the way down. 3. Avoiding the real world. I started this chain of reasoning with the assumption that code is more or less a deterministic system, where one can foresee the consequences of a change. But it isn't. Not really. As far as I can tell, the order in which pip decides to install requirements is complicated, dependent on the version, and can't be easily controlled. There's some links backing me up here in the article. Even for recent versions, the specifications are very loose. If I read it correctly, the order in which I specify my requirements shouldn't matter. And here again, there is a link to the official specifications in the article. Yet, in spite of the fact that ordering doesn't seem to matter in the deterministic realm of ideal programming, in the real world, I know that if I rearrange even a single line of this requirements.txt file, there's a 20% chance that within 2 weeks I'll get reports of install issues I thought I had fixed half a year ago. And here there's a link to a requirements.txt file in one of my projects. So really, maybe the rational assumption that the programming world is deterministic doesn't always hold. Maybe sometimes certain patterns do get crystallized due to a form of selection. Maybe it really doesn't matter if a function returns 0 or 1, as long as you never use that return value. But maybe the indeterminable but not random behavior of your CPU when struck by a cosmic ray means that the difference between these two things is that between utter disaster and business as usual. Probably not. It's e to the power of minus BusyBeaver 100 unlikely. But why risk it? So Overall, I think I retain my bias for phantom status quos, even though it might well be misguided. I might be masking an irrational aversion to change with this fancy sociological argument, but you never know. And on the whole, provided no compelling reason, I think I'll choose to keep my mental status quo.